research firm to do some research on this in 2015. So that 38,000 market affordable number dates back to then. We also know of the 93,000 rental housing units in the city that about 12,000 of them are affordable restricted. That means they have some form of subsidy attached to them where income and rents are restricted. So that gives you a sense of the rental stock. Basically that about 3 times as many of the units are market affordable than are subsidized affordable. So the market affordable housing stock is a really important form of affordable housing for our residents. In terms of production, the city's Livable Communities Act production goal is about 422 units a year. They give us an annual number from 2011 to 2020, and a 10-year number, and the annual number ends up being about 422 units, and we're a little shy of achieving that. We also know that the housing supply, the rental housing supply, is becoming less affordable. Part of that is attributable to an increase in the sales of apartment units. Minnesota Housing Partnership released a study in 2016 showing that between 2010 and 2015, there were 355 property sales in the city of Minneapolis that represented over 10,000 units changed hands. Now, we don't know whether every single one of those units experienced a rent increase, but we know that a very significant portion of them did. Additionally, based on census data, we know that through units raising and becoming upmarket, meaning rents increase, we have approximately 12,000 fewer affordable units for households that are below 50% of the area median income than we did in 2000. So here's some information on the demand for housing, rental housing in our city. More than half of our residents are renters. About half of them are cost burdened, meaning that they pay more than 30% of their income for housing. And we know that the cost burden rate of low income renters in particular has increased pretty significantly, from 64% of low income renters in 2000 to 74%. And compared with those who were renting in 2000, today's renters are have lower incomes and higher housing costs than they did. The chart there shows owners and renters, and on the right you can see that renter income is about 14% lower than it was in 2000, and housing costs are about 11% higher. In response to these issues, we have seen a pretty important regional response. The Greater Minnesota Housing Fund has created a NOAA Impact Fund of $25 million. They have recently announced that they've been successful in raising all $25 million. They plan to launch this fund in May, and their goal is to preserve 1,000 units of at-risk market affordable housing throughout the Twin Cities metropolitan area. A lot of support has been provided to this initiative. McKnight Foundation and Hennepin County HRA and others have contributed to this fund. Additionally, Freddie Mac, in partnership with some local nonprofits, local and national nonprofits, and the National Housing Trust have created a demonstration project to proactively try to acquire properties and preserve them. In the city of Minneapolis, we've been having discussions about this. In 2016, the City Council approved a change in the city's investment policy, allowing the city to actually invest in mortgage-backed securities where the underlying mortgage is for a NOAA property. And that hasn't been used yet, but when it is used, and we hope it will be in combination with this fund and the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, we hope that it will result in a 0.5 percentage point or a percentage point lower interest rate on those projects, which can be a direct pass-through then to lower rents. Another initiative is what is before you today, the NOAA Preservation Fund, and we are also doing research and proposing some changes to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and other city policies to better support preservation efforts. So the proposed guidelines, first of all, NOAA, or naturally occurring affordable housing, defined. We are defining it as rental housing in the private market without government subsidy, where at least 20% of the units are affordable to households with 60% of the area median income. We are also proposing, for the purposes of this program, to include in that definition rental housing that previously received local subsidy or low-income housing tax credits, and the income and/or rent restrictions will expire within the next 5 years. Most of the subsidized housing that we do have in the city is subject to some limited amount of affordability, and so preserving those when that affordability expires will be an important objective as well. Eligible properties, for the purposes of this program, we're proposing that the properties be in good condition and occupied by tenants that are at risk of displacement due to anticipated rent increases. Eligible borrowers include nonprofit organizations, and those nonprofit organizations that are leveraging resources from the 2 pilot initiatives that I mentioned, the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund Impact Fund and the Freddie Mac demonstration.
Ms. Brennan, I don't know if people are holding questions or not. I would ask why we would include rental housing that previously received local subsidy or tax credits that would expire within 5 years. We already catch those projects through the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. That's almost like encouraging people in nonprofits to turn around and let their project fall out of compliance to get this money. I thought the purpose was to take private people on the market who are not connected with government assistance at all and try to save those units.
Sure, Madam Chair. It is primarily targeted to the totally non-subsidized without any form of public investment. However, the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund did expand, and the Common Bond Freddie Mac initiative have expanded their definition to cover these properties where there's no requirement that they maintain affordability after a 15-year period. So the question before you is whether you want to have a resource to be able to continue to the affordability in those properties, because right now we don't have we have very limited tools in order to do that.
So I would kind of phrase it as we would allow double dipping. So we'd say, okay, we funded your project the first time around, and now you're not that charitable anymore, so we're going to fund it a second time around. And if you allow that segment of the population to get into this pool, the Steve Friends properties of the world will never get a penny of this money, because all of the sophisticated players who are involved in this market, who have purposely allowed their tax credits to expire, knowing they'll get this source of money, will come in over all of the other small players.
Well, Madam Chair, I think that we do have some leverage if we have certain types of funding already in the project. For example, if we have funded it in the past with Affordable Housing Trust Fund, then we have the leverage. We have some negotiating leverage, can come to the table and negotiate continued use of those funds for continued affordability. But in some cases, they're at the end of a 15-year tax credit affordability period, and there are no longer any strings, and there's no agreement in place to continue affordability. And as far as they're concerned, they performed on their agreement to provide affordability for that period of time.
Well, I guess if we're just noting that we're just going to be in the business of subsidizing nonprofit and for-profit developers, we could do this. Otherwise, I'm more interested in like the one person, the Dans of the world that owns a property in Elliott Park that kept it affordable at $400 a unit forever, and now the stadium's there and they want to sell it and make money. They've never touched a public penny up until now. Those are the buildings I'm interested in seeing preserved, not the people who know how to game the system, who have basically taken money from us and now want to take more money from us in order to get a little bit more affordability. I mean, the Dans of the world with one building in Elliott Park are not going to have a lawyer, a lobbyist, and a knowledge of our system like the people who currently are operating in this space. I almost think we should prevent them from operating in this pool of money, because it's only $1.5 million, whereas all of those other nonprofit CDCs None of them, by the way, doing this. They're mainly the for-profit providers of affordable housing. So I don't want to blame the CDCs, but they know how to game the system. I'm worried about the one-up buildings in, the Ninth Ward where there's all these problems. We want to go in and preserve those buildings, not help the Dominions of the world buy out of their tax credits at 15 years.
So, Madam Chair, what we can do, staff, we can research whether what alternative options we may have in this fund to either prioritize the unsubsidized or recommend that provision be eliminated. So if we can work on that over the next week or so, and
I could live with the priority ranking, but then I would say if we're asking people to rank these projects, that if you've never gotten a penny from us before, you get 100 more points than anyone who hasn't, because the people who know how to get money from the system are very adept at it. And those that don't want to, but would maybe be willing to do it to save the 40 tenants they have living in 40 SRO units in Elliott Park, they don't even kind of want to use our money. We have to encourage them to keep those units affordable. I think it's those harder to deal with cases we really want to get at. Now, maybe the committee thinks totally differently, but I would think that wouldn't be the best use of our money. Otherwise, the Dominions of the world are going to know. Well, we might as well threaten to opt out and mark up to market rate, because in 5 years there's going to be this pool of money to save these units. They'll know how to game the system without question, but I'm interested in what other people think, and there's a lot of people with housing policy experience on this panel. Everyone has their thing up. I think Councilmember Kano was first.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. I'll come back to this slide. Could you go back to maybe one slide behind? Nope, one more. So the city, the bullet point that says city LCA production goal is 422 units a year at 60% AMI. Is that restricted, or is that the market affordable, the 422?
Sure, Madam Chair, Councilmember Kano. That represents the city agreed to goal with the Met Council for production of new units. So that does not include preserving existing affordable housing. That is, the Met Council assigns to all of the cities within the metropolitan area what their affordable housing target should be. And we were assigned a 10-year number of 4,220 units. So if you average that out annually, it's 422 units a year to be produced, so new units created. So the purpose of including that number on this slide in this preservation discussion is wanted to represent that it's going to take us a long time to produce the level of affordability that we are potentially losing through the loss of the naturally occurring affordable housing.
Okay, and if we could go back to the slide that we were just on now. As you know, we have a lot of buildings in the Ninth Ward that are at the threat of, are potentially going to displace tenants, and there's a lot of people that are talking about the anticipated rent increases that impact mostly immigrant folks, undocumented people, low-income renters. And so I'm curious about this third bullet point where it talks about NOAA properties in good condition, because we've had a lot of conversations with potential nonprofit housing developers who favor affordable housing and want to do more affordable housing, but their assessment is that some of the buildings in the Ninth Ward are just so dilapidated that it's really expensive for them to even consider taking over any of those buildings or purchasing them from current landlords that aren't meeting the city's needs or the renters' needs or the residents' needs at that. So I'm just curious about, like, why did you choose to put in the terms good condition? What does that mean for the buildings in the parts of our city where we might need the most support, but maybe the buildings don't fit into a good condition category? Or maybe you can explain what good condition means so I can better understand whether or not this would actually help some of those buildings that we anticipate will be in big trouble in the coming months and years.
Sure, Madam Chair, Councilmember Kano. You're absolutely right. That is another very huge need that we have in the city, to try to identify a way to preserve the properties that are more distressed or that have have capital improvements that are needed. This is not a one-size-fits-all program. This program specifically was created to try to leverage some of these other initiatives that regionally are happening. The Greater Minnesota Housing Fund Impact Fund, the Freddie Mac demonstration. And in order to do that, what we're trying to do is we're trying to give nonprofit housing providers a competitive edge. When they are going out and trying to compete to acquire these properties in the city, we want to be able to help them with their ability to be successful in getting them. So in order to do that, we need to move very, very quickly. And we're not able to move quickly if we use our funds for acquisition and rehab. There are a lot of, because then all of the requirements that come into the rehabilitation of the property that the city has to review, and we have certain rules and regulations around property improvements. But what we are able to do and how we can act very quickly as a city is through acquisition. So for this program, we are proposing that we work with these two other initiatives and they're also targeting properties that are in good condition so that they can move quickly. But we are doing research with a lot of community partners to identify what are the needs in that sort of distress NOAA category, and what are the gaps, what is preventing housing providers from being successful and being able to acquire and preserve those properties, and what role could the city reasonably play in filling that gap. So we are having those discussions, and we will be having more conversations with you about some potential ways that the city may be helpful in that category of NOAA.
Councilman Mercado, I think you hit the nail on the head, though, here. I have these properties in my ward, 1515th as an example, where it's in distress shape. And now I'm hearing you say, we wouldn't go in and buy that one because it's just in such bad shape. It would take them so long to acquire all of the money, 9% tax credits or whatever else, in order to rehab it. I'm a little bit alarmed by that, because I think that's the case for most of these buildings, is not just that they're about to be sold, but they've had all this deferred maintenance. This is a very small amount of money, $1.5 million in the scheme of things. So as long as we continue to look at ways we can address the Alden 1515th, I can completely relate to what Councilmember Kano is saying. It sounds like we'd probably need a bigger pool of money and more time for those buildings. You're talking about the ones we can fast have nonprofits bid on and get before Sherman, Dominion, whoever else comes in and marks them up to market rate because they're already in good shape, correct?
Exactly.
So it's important for us to just note what this money is going to be going for. I also, like Councilmember Kano, thought it was going for potentially buying buildings that were in terrible shape. And as long as we continue to work towards a solution on that, I'm comfortable with this, because we'll need a lot more money for the larger picture. But I'm glad you brought that up. I didn't catch that until you brought it up right now. Councilmember Quincy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this is a great conversation. First of all, I'm excited to have any kind of project that's looking for it. NOAA projects is a good start. I was just looking at the definition of when I say naturally occurring affordable housing, and I think when we've already put a government subsidy in it, it's not naturally occurring. It was intentionally to occur. That's what we did. So that's why I have a problem, as the chair does, with if they've already received a subsidy, it seems like it doesn't fall under the idea of naturally occurring. And the other problem I had with it is we're looking at, if somebody's trying to do this and you have a 15-year requirement of affordability and they can do it within 5 years, you're talking about turning over a property within 10 years of sale. And that seems a little bit squishy to me as well. So those are the two issues that I have with it. I think it should be focused on the private market without government subsidy first, if not on a priority basis, at least, or on a exclusive basis, on a priority basis, where we're recognizing that investment, we're maintaining that. I also understand it's not about rehab, it's about acquisition and responding quickly. So I too was torn with the idea of good condition versus the ones that are going through a home line experience or a tenant remediation act, and we need some kind of regulatory environment or regulatory impact as well. But I can see why we'd have to go with good condition because we want to make sure that it stays on the market before being flipped and turned into a gentrification issue. So thank you for that.
Councilmember Frye.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What sort of ability do developers have to try and go back to renew their 4%, 9% low income tax credits after that period has expired or when it's about to expire? I mean, obviously, I understand they don't want to renew them. Rather, they would just want to flip it to market rate. But do they have any sort of first preference?
So, Madam Chair, Councilmember Frye, this is sort of a three-part response. The first part is that no one forces them to, well, let me back up. For the tax credit program, there's the competitive 9% credits. We all know those are 30 years no matter what. It's the less competitive 4% tax credits that are allocated in connection with the issuance of tax-exempt bonds. And those allow for owners to opt out of the affordability requirements after year 15. If they
Now
don't,
we're changing that.
yes,
Right.
we are proposing.
Just to be clear, we're proposing changing that.
We will be before you proposing a change to our qualified allocation plan extending that. But right now, most of the projects that have been allocated these 4% credits, a lot of owners have voluntarily said, I will waive my right to opt out in year 15. But for the owners that did not waive their right, when year 15 comes along, they can say, we no longer want to participate in this program.
When they waive the right to opt out, do they get more money, or is it still just the lump sum that they got initially in the 4% tax credits? Because why would you ever opt out to continue the affordability if that gap is not continuously being covered between the market rate and the affordable level?
Exactly. The benefit to them is that they can increase their rents. And so what happens is that in strong market areas, owners see a tremendous benefit in opting out of the tax credit restrictions, and then they can increase their rents. So it's in areas where the market rent is higher than the tax credit rent.
Right.
And it doesn't change the amount of tax credit equity that they received. They received the tax credit equity when the project was built, and they received it for their 15 years or their 20 years or their 30 years, whatever that period is. It's the same amount of equity that they raised from that resource. So they don't get any additional resource for staying in.
Okay.
That's why for-profit developers are the worst players in this space, because they'll take our subsidy to have restricted rents as long as it's only for a short period of time. Then they want to be free of us to raise rents. That's why we have to be much more cautious of what they're doing now.
Well, right, but we just need to make sure that they're still going to do the affordable project now at 20 or 30 years rather than 15 with the same amount of money.
And we're looking at doing that.
Right. But we need to be right. Okay. Okay. One real other quick question. You said we were kind of investing in mortgage-backed securities. What does that investment look like? I mean, we're investing broadly in like a tranche of mortgage-backed securities. Or?
Sure. No, the city invests its funds in different funds, and Councilmember Quincy, as chair of the Ways and Means, you could speak to this better than I could, but we're already purchasing mortgage-backed securities right now that are federally insured. And so this investment change, it changed the required maturity. So we could invest in them as long as the maturity didn't exceed a certain number of years. And the mortgage-backed securities with under this Freddie program to finance these NOAA properties, the maturity date is longer than 5 years. So that was just a policy change to allow us to invest in a longer term type of investment.
And then how does it decrease the interest rates by, I forget what the percentage you said was.
Sure, because when the mortgage-backed security is then placed with an investor, most investors require a higher return than the city would require.
Okay.
So the city would require the same return that it usually gets, which is, I think, close. It's like the treasury rate.
Yeah.
And so we would just require a lower interest rate on on that investment. And it's anywhere from, at the time the policy change was made, as rates change, that would change. But
Yeah.
at that time, it was estimated to be about a half of a point to a point,
Okay. That makes
which
sense.
could result in $600 to $900 in rent savings for a tenant over a period of a year.
Yeah, not bad. That's helpful.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't. So again, continued with the proposed guidelines. The terms of this funding would be a 15-year deferred loan at either 0 or 1% interest, not to exceed $25,000 per affordable unit, and again for acquisition funding only. The affordability requirements is that the affordability period would be coterminous with the loan period. So when the funds are returned, that would trigger the end of the affordability period. And then 75% of the units rent and income restriction is at 80% of the area median income. Now that's the ceiling. There's also limits on rent increases during the year. So when we are presented with a proposal, then we will ask for a 15-year cash flow pro forma. We'll be able to see what they're assuming for income or for rent increases. We are proposing to limit the rent increase for the first 2 years to no more than 5% per year. I am told from the nonprofit providers out there that are trying to acquire these properties that will be a stretch. So it will be hard to acquire the properties and make the necessary capital improvements with only a 5% rent increase. So we're really kind of walking a fine line. We want to make sure that we are providing for some basic tenant protections because, how much of a rent increase can most low-income renters absorb? So we're setting it, we had to pick somewhere to set it. We picked 5%, thinking that that is something that most providers could probably be able to live with. But again, this is a moving target. The market is changing as I'm talking. And so, we are doing the best that we can to try to structure something that can be effective in this marketplace. But it's not entirely clear that that's exactly what the percentage is. We did, since this is a proposed new program for the city, we went out for a public comment, a 45-day public comment period. We didn't get a lot of comment. The comments that we got were very, very positive, expressing strong support from Minneapolis, trying to do something to address NOAA. And the recommendations that we received to try to strengthen the program, like increased tenant protections, as Councilmember Cano pointed out, expanding the program to address NOAA property in need of capital improvements, which, as I mentioned, we're doing some research to try to come up with some proposals along those lines for you to consider in the future, and recommending long-term affordability. So we, again, feel like we've structured the program to address these issues to the best of our ability, given the resources that we have and the market reality.
Okay. Are there further questions for Ms. Brennan?
One more.
Councilman
When will
Brennan?
this money be available? When is the RFP going to be issued?
Sure. So the other request before you is to approve the program guidelines and then also to authorize the CPED director to execute loan documents. So again, when the housing providers are out trying to compete for these properties, they have a 60-day turnaround time. So we need to be able to move very quickly. As a result, the reason why you had such a very, very thick packet is because all of the loan documents have been approved by the city attorney, and those are the loan documents that will need to be used for this program. So upon approval, we can be ready to go as soon as we have proposals before us and our partner organizations are ready to go. Late spring, summer.
Okay, so it will be very interesting to see how fast we see any response to this. It could happen really fast, or there could be no response because the amount of money is so low, that rehab is such a big issue with some of these properties. So I definitely think we should take this year to kind of see what happens. I mean, I want everyone to remember that $1.5 million is nothing. 10 million in the trust fund, millions in tax credits and bonds. This is a teeny tiny amount of money. So it's just like a toe in the water in terms of what we could do eventually. So I think it makes sense to just test out what the market says to us in terms of whether or not this is helpful. And then we can review what happens if no one takes this money, or if there are 10 applications for one grant. Because I would assume all of the money will go to one project, I guess.
It could be likely. And the other thing that we're hearing is that these projects are really, really hard to compete for. So there are multiple offers. So even with some incentives, it may be hard for anyone whose intention it is to preserve the affordability to be effective in the competition.
Are there further questions or comments for Ms. Brennan? Seeing none, I'll move the staff recommendation and just encourage us to be looking at the rehab and purchase issue as well in the coming year. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That item is approved. Seeing no further business before us, we are adjourned.